topic for this video is Isaiah 2 chiasms. We're not studying Isaiah 2, but we're studying something in Isaiah 2 and in other prophecies called chiasms, and that's going to be our real topic here. Isaiah 2 is a wonderful chapter in many ways. It's got lots of good things in the prophecy that's in there, but we can only look at its use of chiasms here. It'd be much too long for this video to look at everything that Isaiah 2 is saying. And so this chiasms thing is what we're going to be focusing on. And we're choosing Isaiah 2 because it makes heavy use of chiasms. It has nested chiasms, which isn't that uncommon. It has multiple chiasms, which isn't all that common. It has linked chiasms, which are really very rare. You don't see that much. And so this use of chiasms, and although you may not know what chiasms are right now, I'll explain it to you in a moment. But Isaiah uses chiasms in all the possible ways and in multiple ways. And so it really can be thought of as a training session for chiasms. If you want to learn how chiasms work in the Bible, Isaiah 2 is where you want to start. So what is a chiasm? A chiasm is a way of marking a section of text that the author wants to highlight. And the author here, of course, is God. And this technique is very rarely used in any kind of literature other than the Bible. But so the situation is that the prophets didn't have something that we have currently in our lives. They didn't have highlighter pens. So you couldn't just say, highlight this text here and say, this is really important. I want you to understand this text here and focus on this text, because the point I'm trying to make is really in this part that I've highlighted. And so because they didn't have highlighter pens or in any way like that to do it, the only thing that God could do is that God would repeat a small text before and after the highlighted text. Okay, so the text that you're supposed to really be focused on and to see as the highlighting, there's going to be a text that comes before that and after that, or one that is maybe not identical, but really, really close. And we're going to see lots of good examples from Isaiah 2 here about that. And so the highlighting is done by putting the same text, or essentially the same text, before and after the highlighted text. You need to understand that. And so we discover those when we're reading through them, because we notice, boy, there's a lot of repetition in this text. Why is there so much repetition? Well, that's a good clue that maybe you're looking at chiasms and a lot of chiasms. And Isaiah is exactly that. You see repetition and repetition and repetition in this one section. And that's what's going on. You're running into chiasms and seeing all those repetitions. So the way it works, and let me get my laser pointer out here, is that there's a text. Now I've used Dumbo the elephant as my example here. So you'll see a text here called Dumbo was an elephant. And if you look further down in the whole text body, you'll see that exact same or very similar expression used. Now it can be very short, like here, a few words. Sometimes it's, as in Isaiah 2 here, it's long sentences that are being repeated or essentially repeated, so close to a repeat that it's just obviously a repeat. And so the idea here is that this text is highlighting the insides of this. So everything between this and this are what God wants you to take a look at as this is really important stuff. This is the highlighted part. Okay, now what you can also do is you can have another chiasm inside of that chiasm. So we have the Dumbo was an elephant chiasm. Inside of that, there's a Dumbo had many friends. And if you see that repeated again, you say, oh, there we are, another chiasm. And so this is the extra highlighted. This is even more highlighted. And so this is really, really important highlight. And then so these two are marking off this extra highlighted area. And then down below it, when you've now returned to what was just inside of the Dumbo was an elephant chiasm, the text that's in here is the, let's say, the second level, the least important or less important highlighted section. So the really important thing is in the nested chiasm, so the chiasm that's inside of a chiasm, that's the really important part. And this is the less important highlight, but still highlighted section here. Okay, so this is a typical example of how a chiasm works. And these are named traditionally. This is generally called the A level. This would be the B level. And in the Bible, sometimes there are many levels, and there are C's, D's, E's, and on like that. And Isaiah doesn't go that deep. He only goes to a B level, and we'll see that when we get to it. Okay, so this is Isaiah 2, beginning the first chiasm. And the verse says, enter the rock and hide in the dust from the terror of the Lord and from the splendor of his majesty. Okay, Now, I'll tell you in advance that we're going to see this phrase repeated. If you're just reading through Isaiah 2 yourself, you would have to do the analysis that I've done already to find the chiasms. And as I said before, you find the chiasms by noticing that there's a lot of repetition. And so this is going to highlight the text that comes between this phrase and this phrase almost identically repeated later on. Okay, so the next verse after verse 10 is this one, and it's going to be starting another chiasm. So they're going to have a chiasm inside of a chiasm here. So it says, the proud look of man will be abased, and the loftiness of man will be humbled, and the Lord alone will be exalted in that day. And we're going to see essentially that exact phrase repeated later on. And so this is going to highlight the text that follows after it, and it's going to be the B chiasm that's inside of the A. Now, there's two A's in this set in Isaiah 2. So I'm calling them A1 and A2. So the first chiasm that we opened is the A1, and this is the B that goes inside of it. Okay, so it's going to be highlighting the text between the opening B, which is this, and the closing B, which we'll see later on. And so B starts before A1 is repeated, and so we know that B is inside of A. We know that there's going to be a repetition of the A text that's going to close the A chiasm, but it hasn't closed it yet. So this is definitely a nested chiasm that we're looking at. So what's inside of this? What's the verses inside of this that God wants us to really highlight? Because this is a chiasm inside of a chiasm. And I'll just read you part of it. And the first verse from that is, for the Lord of hosts will have a day of reckoning against everyone who is proud and lofty, and against everyone who is lifted up, that he may be abased. So the message there is, a day is coming when your pride and all of the things that you think about yourselves being so wonderful, that's going to be dropped down to zero. You're going to not think like that anymore. And he's talking about the millennial period when God is ruling on the earth. And this whole message continues through Isaiah 2:16, and that's where we'll find the closing sentence again for the chiasm B. So this part is the part that God really wants the reader to focus and understand on. This a day is coming when your pride is going to be crushed down. Okay, so after those verses come that's the same verse, almost identically to what we saw before when we opened Chiasm B. And it says, the pride of man will be humbled, and the loftiness of men will be abased, and the Lord alone will be exalted in that day. Okay, and then it has another piece here, but the idols will completely vanish. We'll explain that in just a moment. And so this verse 17 looks very close to Chiasm B that started in verse 11, okay? And that was, here it is, verse 11, the proud look of man will be abased, and the loftiness of man will be humbled, which is very, very similar. And then it says, and the Lord alone will be exalted in that day, which is exactly the same. So this verse 11 is very close to identical to 17, just a little bit of shuffling of the words. And there's that new part on there, but the idols will completely vanish. And what that is it's content that is inside of chiasm A still. So we've, with the closing verse 17, closing that chiasm B that was inside of the A1, now we're still just in the A1 chiasm. And so this text that we see extra here is text that continues on in the A1 chiasm. Hope that's understood. Okay, so men will go into the caves of the rocks and into holes of the ground before the terror of the Lord and the splendor of his majesty when he arises to make the earth tremble. Now, this is the text that we saw earlier that opened the chiasm A1, and now we're seeing essentially the exact same thing being repeated here to close the A1 chiasm. And so back in verse 10 is where we saw it open, and it said, enter the rock and hide in the dust from the terror of the Lord and from the splendor of his majesty. And you can see that the same thing about terror of the Lord, the splendor of his majesty, is exactly what we saw in verse 19. So we see that same thing and the same ideas presented here again 9 or 10 verses later. So this is definitely the closing of the A1 chiasm. But there's an extra piece on it. There's this new when clause, when he arises to make the earth tremble. And it's going to turn out that this clause with that verse 19 is going to be repeated again in total. So what we've got here is a new chiasm being opened up that is linked to the first chiasm. So we're calling this one the A2 chiasm because it's linked to A1. It's not a new, completely separate chiasm. It is linked because this top part here of 19 is the end of the A1, but this piece that gets added onto it along with this part here is going to be repeated again. And so we're really seeing the chiasm A1 being continued on, linked into a new chiasm, if that makes some sense that way. So we're opening a new chiasm here that we're calling A2, and it's a linked chiasm because of the way this is done in the text. And so it uses all of verse 19. So the A2 chiasm uses this whole thing, all of 19, as its opener. And so we're going to expect that to be the same for its closing text. It's going to close the chiasm. Okay, so what we see in here is something really interesting, and this is something special too about Isaiah 2. What we see inside of this linked chiasm is this verse. In that day, men will cast away to the moles and the bats their idols of silver and their idols of gold, which they made for themselves to worship. Now, this is interesting. This is the textual equivalent of an illustration in the Bible. The Bible doesn't have illustrations in it. We wish it did, but of course, all the people who copied the Bible down to the 2,000 years couldn't have been great artists, and they wouldn't have done a good job of it. And so illustrations are done in text, okay? And that's what we're seeing here. There's a text here, and it's not just a text that's an illustration. It's a humorous visual illustration, okay? This is supposed to be funny. You're supposed to see the idea of men running around, casting away to the moles and the bats, all these idols that they have that they made for themselves to worship. And so, and that's funny, partly because it's just slapstick humor, but it's also partly because they're casting away these idols to animals that live in the dark and cannot see their glitter. Okay, so a mole lives underground, can't see anything in the dark. Bats fly only at night in the dark, and so neither of them can see the glitter of these idols that people are trying to throw away to them. So next we see, we're up to verse 21 of Isaiah 2 now. In order to go into the caverns of the rocks and the clefts of the cliff before the terror of the Lord and the splendor of his majesty when he arises to make the earth tremble. Okay, so what we're seeing here now is the closing of that A2 chiasm. And so this whole big chunk here, in essence, is a repeat of version 19. It's verse 19 said, men will go into caves of the rocks and into holes of the ground before the terror of the Lord and the splendor of his majesty when he arises to make the earth tremble. So we see that's really, really close. Almost exactly the same thing. And certainly the last part there, when he arises to make the earth tremble, and the Lord and the splendor of his majesty, all of those things are direct, exact copies. So that's what we're seeing here is now the closing for the A2 chiasm. So the whole A2 is now closed off. And so we've seen this whole process. I'll just kind of summarize it quickly here. We saw the opening of a chiasm that would normally be called an A, but we called it A1 because it is linked to another one. And so we called that A1, and then inside of A1 there was another chiasm that we called B, and we saw some content inside of the B chiasm, and then the B chiasm closed, and we were still inside of the A1 chiasm. We saw some content there, and we highlighted that. And then we saw that interesting link to an A2 chiasm that led us to this humorous visual illustration done in words. And then we see the closing of all of these chiasms. So we've really seen all that you can possibly do, I think, with a chiasm. I can't think of anything more, and I haven't seen anything more done with a chiasm than what we've seen here in Isaiah 2. And so if we took all of this and tried to put it into more of a page form like we would do in a magazine or a published article like we would do in our time, we would see something more like this. See, enter the rock and hide in the dust. That was the opener for the first chiasm that we called the A1 chiasm. And then inside of that, we have this next section here with its header. And the header is the proud look of man will be abased. And you remember that from the verse. And then it had all that content that I told you about. I read just the first verse of that content. And so you could put it in blocks like this that would show you that this part here that was highlighted in the Bible using chiasms would be highlighted in our text in a blocked out format inside of another blocked out format, because remember, this part of it was the B chiasm inside of the A chiasm, A1 chiasm actually. Okay, and then this part finishes, this would be the B chiasm part, it finishes, and then we continue on inside of the A1 chiasm, and just those few words, it says, but the idols will completely vanish, okay? And then that took us to the end of that chiasm, but it's linked to another chiasm. And this chiasm is linked with the words, when he arises to make the earth tremble. Those are the new words in this linked chiasm. And if you remember, the part that was inside of this chiasm was the comical illustration, and the words for that were, in that day men will cast away to the moles and the bats their idols of silver and their idols of gold, which they made for themselves. And as that is a comical illustration, I had an artist friend do a rendering of that for me, and that's what you see here. And you can see exactly that being done. And so that's how we would do it if we did this kind of a representation with our modern technology. We would actually have images embedded and we wouldn't rely on text to explain it. Although the text is a little clearer, you would have to do some figuring to understand from this picture if that's all you had to understand it. So captioning it is how I've chosen to represent it here.